When I inherited $35 million, I decided to test my son before he ever knew a cent existed. I called him with my hands shaking and told him the exact opposite of the truth, that his mother had died leaving debts, that the house was under a reverse mortgage, that I had nothing left and nowhere to go. The phone felt incredibly heavy in my hand, a physical weight that seemed to defy the laws of physics, pulling my arm down toward the mahogany surface of the desk in the corner office of Sterling, Vance and Associates. Across from me, Arthur Vance, a probate attorney with 42 years of experience and a face carved from granite and patience, watched me over the rim of his spectacles. On the desk between us lay a document stamped "Confidential, Estate Liquidation and Asset Transfer," and on the final page, a figure that made the air in the room feel thin and rarefied: $35,412,980.14. It was an inheritance from my estranged brother, Robert, a man I hadn't spoken to since 1998, who had quietly amassed a fortune in semiconductor patents before dying without a spouse or children. By the laws of intestacy and a surprisingly detailed will he had drafted 3 weeks before his cardiac arrest, I was the sole beneficiary. I was 68 years old, a retired high school history teacher with a pension of $3,200 a month and a Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on the odometer. My wife, Martha, had passed away 4 months ago from pancreatic cancer, leaving me with a silence in our small bungalow that was louder than any scream. This money could fix everything. It could buy a villa in Tuscany, a new life, a distraction from the grief. But as I looked at the number, my first thought wasn't of travel or luxury cars. It was of my son, Julian. Julian, who hadn't visited his mother in the hospice facility during her final 3 weeks because he was swamped with the quarterly review at his branding agency. Julian, who had asked about Martha's life insurance policy at the funeral reception while holding a glass of scotch I had paid for. A cold, serpentine dread coiled in my stomach. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if I told Julian about the $35 million, he would suddenly find the time to visit. He would become the dutiful son. He would manage my affairs, guide my investments, and slowly, surely, siphon the life out of my fortune, just as he had siphoned the joy out of his mother's final years. I couldn't live with that doubt. I needed to know, once and for all, who my son actually was. So, I looked at Arthur Vance and said, "Don't file the transfer paperwork yet. I need to make a call." Arthur, a man who had seen families tear each other apart over grandmother's silverware, nodded slowly. "Take your time, Thomas," he said, his voice a low rumble. I dialed Julian's number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice clipped and impatient. "Dad, I'm literally walking into a meeting with the VP of marketing for a major beverage client. Make it quick." There was no, "How are you?" No, "I've been thinking about you." Just the transactional efficiency of a man who viewed his father as an obligation to be managed. I took a breath, letting my voice tremble, leaning into the exhaustion and grief that were already there. "Julian," I said, pitching my voice to sound frail, "I have bad news. I'm at the lawyer's office now." I heard him stop walking. The background noise of the busy office corridor faded. "The lawyer? Is it about Mom's estate? Did the probate clear?" The greed was subtle, but it was there, a sharp hook in his tone. "It's not what we thought, Julian." I lied, the words tasting like ash. "The medical bills, they were more than the insurance covered. And there were loans. Your mother, she took out a second mortgage and a reverse mortgage on the house 3 years ago to pay for experimental treatments she didn't tell us about. I just found out. The bank is taking the house. The equity is gone. It's all gone. I have nothing, Julian. I'm effectively homeless as of the end of the month." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for 6 agonizing seconds. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When Julian finally spoke, his voice had changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a cold, guarded detachment. "What do you mean, gone? That house was appraised at $600,000. How could she burn through that?" "It's complex," I stammered, improvising the disaster. "Predatory lending, compounded interest. The lawyer says there's nothing to be done. I have to be out in 30 days. Julian, I don't know what to do. I was hoping maybe I could stay in your guest suite for a few weeks, just until I get my pension sorted out and find a small apartment." This was the test. The guest suite in Julian's $2.4 million brownstone in Chicago, a home I had contributed $80,000 toward for the down payment in 2018. "Dad," Julian sighed, a long, exasperated sound that signaled a burden he was unwilling to shoulder. "You know we're in the middle of remodeling the 3rd floor. The dust is everywhere. And honestly, with the baby coming in 5 months, Sarah needs her space. We can't have a roommate right now. It would be too much stress on her." "I wouldn't be a roommate," I pleaded, debasing myself to find the bottom of his character. "I'm your father. I'd help with the house. I just need a place to sleep." "Look," Julian said, his tone hardening, "you need professional help. If you're really indigent, there are state programs, assisted living facilities that take Medicaid. I can send you some links, but I can't bail you out of this, Dad. You and Mom should have planned better. It's frankly irresponsible that you let it get to this point." Irresponsible. The word hung in the air, vibrating with irony. I looked at the document on the desk, at the number $35,412,980.14. "So you can't help me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I can't take you in." "No," Julian said firmly. "I have to go. My meeting is starting." "Good luck, Dad. Let me know where you land." The line went dead. He didn't even say goodbye. He just terminated the connection, severing the lifeline he thought I was begging for. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the desk. My hands were shaking, not from age or frailty, but from a rage so pure and white-hot, it felt like a chemical burn in my veins. Arthur Vance was looking at me, his expression unreadable, though his eyebrows were raised a fraction of an inch. I take it the conversation did not go well, he said. He told me to go to a state shelter, I said, my voice steady now, the tremor gone. He told me it was irresponsible of me to be poor. Arthur took off his glasses and began to polish them with a silk handkerchief. I have seen many things in 40 years of probate law, Thomas. I have seen brothers pull knives on each other. I have seen children forge signatures. But the abandonment of a living parent for the crime of poverty is a special kind of cruelty. What do you want to do? I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the gray city street below. The decision had formed in my mind the moment Julian said the word irresponsible. It wasn't enough to just keep the money from him. That was passive. That was defensive. I needed to understand the full extent of his moral bankruptcy. I needed to witness it without the filter of his performance. File the paperwork, I said, turning back to Arthur. Move the $35 million into a blind trust. I want the existence of these funds buried so deep that even a forensic accountant would need a diving bell to find them. Name yourself as the trustee. Give me a modest monthly allowance, $2,000 cash, and put the rest in low-risk bonds. Arthur frowned. Thomas, you are a wealthy man. You can buy a penthouse. Why live on an allowance? Because, I said, I am going to become exactly what I told Julian I was. I'm going to lose the house. I'm going to sell my car. I'm going to move into a cheap apartment in his city, Chicago. I'm going to be the poor, struggling father he despises. And I'm going to wait. Wait for what? Arthur asked. To see if he ever calls, I replied. To see if he ever offers a dime. To see if he has a shred of humanity left in him. And if he doesn't, then I will know exactly what to do with the money. The next 3 weeks were a blur of dismantling a life. I didn't actually have a reverse mortgage, of course. The house was fully paid off, but I sold it. I listed it for 15% under market value to ensure a quick cash sale, the neighbors whispered. They saw the for sale sign and assumed the worst, that the widower was drowning in debt. I let them assume. I sold the furniture. I sold Martha's china. I sold the lawnmower. I packed my life into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. The proceeds from the house sale, $540,000. I transferred immediately to the blind trust Arthur had set up. To the outside world, that money vanished, ostensibly to pay off the fictitious creditors I had invented. I was methodically erasing my own stability. It was a strange, masochistic process, stripping away the layers of middle-class comfort I had worked 40 years to accumulate. But with every item I sold, with every check I wrote to close a utility account, I felt lighter. I was shedding the expectations of a father and becoming an investigator. I was going undercover in my own life. I moved to Chicago on a rainy Tuesday in November. I didn't tell Julian I was coming. I rented a studio apartment in a decaying building in Rogers Park, miles away from his fashionable neighborhood in Lincoln Park. The rent was $850 a month. The carpet smelled of stale tobacco and mildew. The radiator clanked like a dying engine. The view from the single window was of a brick wall and a dumpster that overflowed with wet cardboard. It was perfect. It was the habitat of the irresponsible man Julian believed me to be. I bought a burner phone, a cheap prepaid device, and kept my old number active only to see if he would call. He didn't. Not on Thanksgiving. Not on the 1-month anniversary of the bad news. I sat in that cramped apartment, eating canned soup and reading books from the public library, and I let the silence of my son wash over me. It was the context phase, the long, slow accumulation of data. I spent my days building a dossier on my own history with Julian, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong. I had been a history teacher. I believed in cause and effect. I looked back at the ledger of our relationship. When he was 16, he crashed the used Toyota Camry I had bought him. He didn't apologize. He complained that the airbags had bruised his face. I bought him another car. Cause and effect. No consequence, no learning. When he got into NYU, the tuition was $65,000 a year. I took extra tutoring shifts. Martha went back to work part-time at the library, and we paid every cent so he wouldn't have loans. He graduated with a 2.8 gigapascals and a taste for designer loafers. Cause and effect. Sacrifice without gratitude breeds entitlement. I thought about the wedding, a lavish affair at a botanical garden. Sarah, his wife, had demanded imported orchids. The bill came to $65,000. Julian had shrugged and said, "It's what she wants, Dad. You want us to be happy, right?" I paid it. I dipped into my retirement savings. I paid it because I wanted to be the provider. I wanted to be the good father. I realize now, sitting on a lumpy mattress in Rogers Park with $35 million sitting in a hidden account, that I hadn't been a good father. I had been an enabler. I had been a cushion that prevented him from ever hitting the hard ground of reality. And now, I was going to remove the cushion. But first, I had to be sure. I had to be absolutely, undeniably sure that the rot went all the way to the core. I needed to see him. I needed to interact with him, not as a voice on the phone, but as a physical presence in his world. I began to track him. It wasn't difficult. Julian lived his life on social media. His Instagram was a public catalog of his consumption. Brunch at the Smith with the bestie wifey. New Tesla Model S plaid mode engage. Just closed a huge deal, hustle culture. I looked at the timestamp on the Tesla post. It was dated 2 days after I called him with the news of my destitution. 2 days after he told me he couldn't help, he had leased a $120,000 car. I felt a cold, clinical detachment settle over me. This was evidence. This was Exhibit A. I started taking walks in his neighborhood. I dressed down an old fraying coat, a beanie pulled low, shoes that had seen better days. I looked like any number of invisible seniors in the city, the kind people look through, not at. I walked past his brownstone. I saw the contractor's trucks out front, the remodel he had mentioned. I saw the new windows going in. I saw Sarah getting out of an Uber with shopping bags from Neiman Marcus. They weren't struggling. They were thriving. They were gorging themselves on the fat of the land while believing I was starving. One afternoon, I saw Julian. He was walking out of a high-end coffee shop on Armitage Avenue, holding a latte and talking on his AirPods. He looked good. Sharp suit, expensive haircut, the confident stride of a man who believes he is the protagonist of the universe. I stood on the corner, waiting for the light to change. He was walking directly toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from anticipation. Would he recognize me? Would he stop? I didn't try to hide. I stood there, 5 feet away, as he passed. He looked right at me. His eyes swept over my face, my old coat, my scuffed shoes, and then they slid away. There was no flicker of recognition, no pause. To him, I wasn't Thomas, his father. I was just background texture, a piece of urban scenery to be ignored. He walked right past me, continuing his conversation. No, I told them the budget is firm at $50K for the launch party. We need the ice sculpture. He walked past his own father to talk about an ice sculpture. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, the wind whipping off the lake, stinging my cheeks. The rejection was total. It wasn't just that he wouldn't help, it was that he didn't even see me. I was invisible to him because I no longer had value to extract. That moment was the catalyst. The sorrow finally evaporated, leaving behind a hard, crystalline resolve. I walked back to the L train, took the red line north to my dreary apartment, and called Arthur Vance. It's time for phase 2, I said. What do you need? Arthur asked. I need you to hire a private investigator, I said. I want a full asset search on my son. I want to know his debts, his credit score, his business partners, his mortgage details, everything. And Arthur? I want to buy the building. Which building? Arthur asked, confused. The brownstone, I said. Julian's house. I want to buy the mortgage note. I want to be the bank. Arthur paused. That is aggressive and complicated. Banks don't usually sell individual performing notes. Find a way, I commanded. Use a shell company. Offer a premium. I don't care what it costs. I want to hold the deed to the roof over his head, and I want to do it before Christmas. It was December 2nd. I had 3 weeks. The game had changed. I wasn't just testing him anymore. I was acquiring him. The discovery phase was about to transition into active engagement. I spent the next few days in the library, researching the intricacies of distress, debt purchasing, and commercial paper. I was learning the language of my new power. I wasn't a history teacher anymore. I was a financier of karma. On December 10th, Arthur called me. We found a way, he said, sounding both impressed and slightly terrified. The mortgage was bundled in a securitized trust, but the servicing rights are held by a mid-sized regional bank that is looking to offload some risk. We can buy a tranche of debt that includes your son's mortgage, but you have to buy the whole pool. It's $4 million. Do it, I said without hesitation. Buy the pool, isolate his note, and then I want to audit his application. Audit it, yes. I remember when he bought that house. He told me he was making $300,000 a year. I want to see the loan application he submitted to the bank. If I know my son, he inflated his income to qualify. And if he lied on a federal loan application, well, that gives the note holder certain rights. Thomas, Arthur warned, this is nuclear. If he committed mortgage fraud and you expose it, he could face prison time or immediate foreclosure. I'm not exposing it yet, I said. I'm just gathering ammunition. Get me the file. 2 days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my studio apartment. I sat at my wobbly kitchen table under the flickering fluorescent light and opened the file. There it was. The Uniform Residential Loan Application, Form 1003, signed by Julian and Sarah Reynolds. I scanned the income section. Stated monthly income, $32,000. Base employment income. I pulled up the tax returns Arthur's investigator had pulled. Julian's actual adjusted gross income for that year was $145,000. He had more than doubled his income on the application. He had forged pay stubs. I saw the photocopies. They looked professional, but the math was slightly off on the FICA withholdings. It was fraud. Clear, undeniable bank fraud. My son was a felon who just hadn't been caught yet, and I was now the bank. I closed the file and looked out at the brick wall. A grim smile touched my lips. I had him. I had the leverage. Now, I just needed the stage. Christmas was coming. The perfect time for a family reunion. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Julian's number again. It was time to give him one last chance. One final opportunity to be a human being before I destroyed his world. He answered on the second ring. Dad? He sounded surprised. I thought, are you still in the city? I am, I said, keeping my voice weak. Julian, it's getting cold. The shelter is. It's not safe. I was wondering if, for Christmas, just for Christmas Eve, I could come over, maybe see the renovations, have a warm meal. Dad, honestly, Julian sighed. The sound of a man being asked for spare change. We're hosting Sarah's parents. It's going to be really tight. It's just not a good time. Maybe we can do a FaceTime or something? I can Venmo you $50 for a hot meal, okay? $50, the price of his father's dignity. Okay, Julian, I said softly. $50. That's generous. Thank you. Great. Sending it now. Gotta run. He hung up. A moment later, my phone pinged. A Venmo notification. Asterisk Julian sent you $50. Christmas dinner. The Santa emoji was the final insult. I looked at the screen, then at the file on the table, then at the confidential balance sheet of my $35 million trust. Merry Christmas, Julian, I whispered to the empty room. Enjoy the house while you can. I called Arthur. He declined the visit. Proceed with the acquisition. And Arthur? Draft a letter from the new mortgage holder, the Shell Company. Tell him there's been an audit of the loan portfolio. Tell him he has 10 days to provide certified proof of income for the origination year or the loan will be called due immediately. You're accelerating the note, Arthur said. He won't be able to pay. He'll lose the house. He told me to go to a shelter, I said. It's time he learned what it feels like to be evicted. The trap was set. The hook was baited. The curtain was about to rise on the most expensive lesson of Julian's life. The certified letter from Atlas Capital Management arrived at Julian's brownstone on December 14th, landing like a mortar shell in the middle of his festive holiday preparations. I wasn't there to see him open it, of course, but Arthur Vance's private investigator, a man named Reynolds who possessed an uncanny ability to blend into woodwork, reported the sequence of events with dry precision. The courier arrived at 10:45 a.m. Julian signed for the envelope with a flourish, likely expecting a holiday bonus check or a contract from a client. He opened it, standing in the doorway. His posture collapsed. He stood there for a full minute, reading the single page that demanded verification of his 2018 income within 10 days, or faced immediate acceleration of the mortgage note due to irregularities detected in the underwriting audit. It was a nightmare scenario for anyone who has built a life on lies. Julian knew, just as I knew, that the income he had stated on that application, $32,000 a month, was a fabrication. He couldn't prove it because it never existed. He spent the next 48 hours in a manic spiral. I tracked his movements through credit card alerts and the PI's updates. He visited 3 different banks, likely trying to secure a bridge loan to pay off the mortgage before the fraud was exposed, but his credit utilization was already at 90%. He was over-leveraged on the Tesla, the renovation, the lifestyle. No one would lend him $4 million on short notice. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. On December 17th, his desperation finally drove him to do what he should have done out of love, but was now doing out of survival. He called me. I stared at the burner phone, buzzing on the laminate table of my studio apartment. It was 8 p.m. I let it ring 3 times before answering, pitching my voice to the familiar, weary timbre of the destitute father. Hello? Dad? His voice was tight, breathless. Hey, listen, I've been thinking about what you said, about needing a place. I remained silent, letting him fill the void. I think we might be able to work something out, he continued, the lie smooth and practiced. Sarah and I talked. We don't want you on the street, but there's a complication. We're having a little temporary cash flow issue with the house. Nothing major, just a banking error, but it might jeopardize the guest room for a few weeks. I don't understand, I said innocently. I thought you were remodeling. We are, he snapped, then caught himself. We are, but this bank thing. Look, Dad, do you have any times assets left? Anything at all? Maybe an old 401k you forgot about? If you could just loan us a little bit, maybe 50 grand, just to show liquidity to the bank, we could secure the house and you could move in. We'd pay you back with interest. It was breathtaking. Even now, facing the abyss, his instinct was not to confess, but to extract. He was trying to mine the father he believed to be bankrupt. Julian, I said, my voice heavy with feigned sorrow. I told you, I have nothing. I sold the china. I sold the car. I have $40 in my checking account. Right, he muttered, the pretense of concern vanishing instantly. Okay, well, I gotta go. Good luck. He hung up. That was the final tumblers of the lock clicking into place. He had tried to con a dying man. There was no redemption left in him. The next morning, Arthur Vance sent the second letter. This one offered a workout meeting. It stated that the lender, Atlas Capital, was willing to discuss a deed in lieu of foreclosure or other settlement options, but required the borrower to appear in person at their Chicago offices on December 23rd. Julian accepted within the hour. He thought he could charm the bank. He thought he could spin his way out of fraud just like he spun his marketing pitches. He didn't know the bank was his father. December 23rd dawned cold and vicious, the wind off Lake Michigan cutting through the heaviest coats. I dressed not in my thrift store disguise, but in a bespoke charcoal suit I had purchased 3 days prior. I put on my vintage Patek Philippe watch, a piece I had retrieved from a safety deposit box. I groomed my beard, combed my hair, and looked in the mirror. The irresponsible old man was gone. In his place stood Thomas, the multi-millionaire, the executioner of his son's ego. I took a limousine to the office tower where Arthur had rented a conference suite under the Atlas Capital name. The view from the 42nd floor was spectacular, a sprawling grid of gray and white. I sat at the head of the long granite table, my back to the door, watching the city. Arthur sat to my right, looking like the Grim Reaper's general counsel. At 10 a.m. sharp, the receptionist opened the door. Mr. Reynolds is here, she announced. I didn't turn around. I heard Julian's footsteps, confident but hurried. Good morning, Julian said, his voice projecting that sales floor confidence. I appreciate you seeing me. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. The income verification is, well, my account accountant is on vacation, but I can assure you the funds are there. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds, Arthur said. The voice was command, not a request. I heard the chair scrape against the floor. Okay, Julian said, sounding slightly unnerved by the lack of pleasantries. Who am I speaking with? I assume you're the portfolio manager? I am the owner of the note, I said, speaking to the window. I purchased your debt 12 days ago. Julian paused. You bought the debt? Why? It's a performing loan. I've never missed a payment. It is a fraudulent loan. I corrected him, still not turning. You fabricated your income. That triggers a default event regardless of payment history. We aren't here to discuss your payment history, Julian. We are here to discuss your character. Julian stood up, his chair clattering back. Excuse me? Who do you think you are? You can't talk to me like that. I want to see your manager. You want to see the manager? I asked. I slowly swiveled the heavy leather chair around. The mechanism was silent. As I turned, I saw Julian's face. He was flushed with indignation, his mouth open to deliver another threat. Then he saw me. The words died in his throat. His eyes went wide, not with recognition at first, but with confusion. He was trying to reconcile the image of the destitute, pleading father he had rejected on the phone with the man sitting before him in a $3,000 suit, radiating power. Dad, he whispered. It was a question, a plea, a hallucination. Sit down, Julian, I said. My voice was calm, the same voice I used to use when he was 12 and had been caught stealing from the corner store. I said, sit down. He collapsed into the chair, his legs giving out. I don't understand. You said you lost the house. You said you were homeless. I lied. I said, just like you lied on your loan application. Just like you lied when you said you were remodeling. Just like you lied when you said you couldn't help me. Arthur slid a folder across the table. This is the deed to your house, Arthur explained, and this is the confession of judgment regarding the mortgage fraud. You have two choices, Mr. Reynolds. Option A, we turn this file over to the FBI. Mortgage fraud is a felony punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million. You will go to jail. Sarah will lose the house anyway. Your child will be born while you are incarcerated. Julian was shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He looked from Arthur to me, his eyes wet. Dad, please. What is this? Option B, I continued, ignoring his distress. You sign the deed over to Atlas Capital, meaning, to me, effective immediately. You vacate the property by January 1st. You acknowledge the debt, and in exchange, I do not file the criminal charges. You walk away with a clean record, but with nothing else. You're evicting me? Julian croaked. I'm your son. Sarah is pregnant. It's Christmas. I know, I said. I asked you for help at Christmas. You sent me $50. I picked up my phone and opened the Venmo app. I turned the screen toward him. The transaction was there, glowing in the high-definition light. $50, Julian. That was the price you put on our relationship. That was the valuation you assigned to the man who raised you. I didn't know, he shouted, desperation making him loud. I didn't know you had money. If I knew you were okay, I wouldn't have. I was just stressed. That is the point, I said, leaning forward. You didn't know. The test wasn't about money. It was about decency. If you had offered me the guest room, if you had offered me a meal, if you had shown up, Julian, I would have given you this. I pulled the bank statement from the folder, the one showing the $35 million. I slid it across the mahogany. Julian looked at the number. His eyes bulged. He stopped breathing. He stared at the digits, $35,412,980.14, and I watched his soul break. He realized, in that split second, the magnitude of his error. He hadn't just lost a house, he had lost an empire. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Dad, $35 million? You have $35 million? I do, I said, and you will never see a penny of it. He started to cry then. Not the manipulative tears of a child caught in a lie, but the weeping of a man watching his future incinerate. He begged, he pleaded, he invoked his mother's name. Mom wouldn't want this. She would want you to help us. Your mother, I said, my voice cutting through his sobbing like a razor, died wondering why you couldn't be bothered to visit her in hospice. Do not speak her name in this room. I stood up. Sign the papers, Julian, or I call the FBI. You have 5 minutes. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Behind me, I heard the scratching of a pen, the sound of a man signing away his life. When he was done, Arthur collected the documents. Julian sat there, slumped, defeated, a shell of the man who had walked in. Get out, I said, without turning around. He left. He walked out of the office, out of the building, and into the cold Chicago wind. I watched from the window as a small figure emerged onto the sidewalk 42 stories below and hailed a cab. He looked very small from up there. The aftermath was swift and clinical. Julian and Sarah moved out on December 30th. I didn't oversee the eviction. I hired a property management company to handle the keys. They moved into a rented townhouse in a far western suburb, a significant downgrade from their Lincoln Park palace. The social fallout was harder to track, but inevitable. The remodel story fell apart. Friends asked questions. The sudden move, the loss of the Tesla, which was repossessed when he couldn't keep up the payments without the home equity line he had been relying on, the change in lifestyle. It all pointed to failure. I heard through the grapevine that Sarah had filed for separation 3 months later, shortly after the baby was born. Apparently, the stress of the financial collapse and the revelation of Julian's fraud, which I suspect he had to confess to her to explain why they were homeless, was too much for their curated marriage to withstand. Julian was living alone, working as a freelance consultant, trying to rebuild from from zero. He sent me letters, long, rambling emails, apologizing, explaining, begging for another chance. He sent photos of the grandson I had never met. I didn't block him, but I didn't reply. I archived them in a folder named The Past. The resolution came slowly, over the course of the next few years. I didn't buy a villa in Tuscany. I found that I had no desire to run away. Instead, I stayed in Chicago. I bought a comfortable, unassuming condo in the Gold Coast. I established the Martha Reynolds Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to providing financial assistance to elderly people facing housing insecurity. I poured my energy into it. I spent my days reviewing grant applications, funding legal aid clinics, and ensuring that no one else would have to feel the terror I had simulated. It was fulfilling work. It gave my grief a shape and a purpose. I saw Julian one last time, 5 years after the meeting. I was coming out of the Symphony Center on a rainy Tuesday evening. I saw him standing under the awning of a nearby building, waiting for a rideshare. He looked older. He had lost weight. He was wearing a raincoat that looked like it came from a department store rack, not a boutique. He was holding a folding umbrella. He looked tired, worn down by the friction of a life without a safety net. He saw me. Our eyes locked across the wet pavement. He didn't wave. He didn't try to approach. He just looked at me with a profound, sad resignation. He nodded, a small, humble gesture of acknowledgement. I nodded back. Then I got into my car, and the driver pulled away. I didn't feel triumph in that moment. I didn't feel anger. I felt a quiet, philosophical peace. I had taught him the lesson. It had cost us both our relationship, but it had saved him from becoming a monster. He was struggling, yes, but he was real. He was living a life he had actually earned, not one he had stolen, and I was living mine. The $35 million was safe, working to help strangers who would never thank me, but who would never leave me to die alone. The ledger was balanced. The test was concluded. I watched the rain streak the window of the car, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and red, and for the first time in years, I thought of Martha and smiled. She would have said I was too hard on him, but she also would have known that sometimes the only way to save a soul is to break the ego that imprisons it. I had broken him to fix him, and that, I decided as the car merged onto Lakeshore Drive, was the most responsible thing a father could do. The certified letter from Atlas Capital Management arrived at Julian's brownstone on December 14th, landing like a mortar shell in the middle of his festive holiday preparations, and I wasn't there to see him open it, of course. But Arthur Vance's private investigator, a man named Reynolds, who possessed an uncanny ability to blend into woodwork, reported the sequence of events with dry precision. The courier arrived at 10:45 a.m., and Julian signed for the envelope with a flourish, likely expecting a holiday bonus check or a contract from a client. But when he opened it, standing in the doorway, his posture collapsed, and he stood there for a full minute, reading the single page that demanded verification of his 2018 income within 10 days, or faced immediate acceleration of the mortgage note due to irregularities detected in the underwriting audit. It was the nightmare scenario for anyone who has built a life on lies, because Julian knew, just as I knew, that the income he had stated on that application, $32,000 a month, was a fabrication that he couldn't prove, because it never existed. He spent the next 48 hours in a manic spiral, and I tracked his movements through credit card alerts and the PI's updates, noting that he visited 3 different banks, likely trying to secure a bridge loan to pay off mortgage before the fraud was exposed, but his credit utilization was already at 90%, and he was over-leveraged on the Tesla, the renovation, and the lifestyle, so no one would lend him $4 million on short notice. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and on December 17th, his desperation finally drove him to do what he should have done out of love, but was now doing out of survival, which was calling me. I stared at the burner phone buzzing on the laminate table of my studio apartment at 8 p.m., and let it ring 3 times before answering, pitching my voice to the familiar weary timbre of the destitute father. When he asked if we could work something out because he and Sarah didn't want me on the street, but claimed they were having a little temporary cash flow issue with the house, I remained silent, letting him fill the void with his lies about a banking error. Then came the extraction attempt where he asked if I had any assets left, maybe an old 401k or 50 grand, just to show liquidity to the bank, promising to pay me back with interest. And it was breathtaking that even now, facing the abyss, his instinct was not to confess, but to extract, mining the pot. Father, he believed to be bankrupt. I told him I had sold the china and the car, and had $40 in my checking account, and the pretense of concern vanished instantly as he hung up. That was the final tumbler of the lock, clicking into place because he had tried to con a dying man, and there was no redemption left in him. So the next morning, Arthur Vance sent the second letter, offering a workout meeting, stating that the lender Atlas Capital was willing to discuss a deed in lieu of foreclosure or other settlement options, but required the borrower to appear in person at their Chicago offices on December 23rd. Julian accepted within the hour, thinking he could charm the bank and spin his way out of fraud, just like he spun his marketing pitches, not knowing the bank was his father. December 23rd dawned cold and vicious with the wind off Lake Michigan, cutting through the heaviest coats, and I dressed not in my thrift store disguise but in a bespoke charcoal suit I had purchased 3 days prior, putting on my vintage Patek Philippe watch, a piece I had retrieved from a safety deposit box, and and grooming my beard, until the irresponsible old man was gone, and in his place stood Thomas the multimillionaire, the executioner of his son's ego. I took a limousine to the office tower, where Arthur had rented a conference suite under the Atlas Capital name, and the view from the 42nd floor was spectacular, a sprawling grid of gray and white, where I sat at the head of the long granite table, my back to the door, watching the city, while Arthur sat to my right, looking like the Grim Reaper's general counsel. At 10 a.m. sharp, the receptionist opened the door, and I heard Julian's footsteps, confident but hurried as he greeted us, saying he was sure this was all just a misunderstanding, and that his accountant was on vacation, but he could assure us the funds were there. Arthur told him to sit down in a voice that was a command, not a request, and I heard the chair scrape against the floor as Julian asked who he was speaking with, assuming I was the portfolio manager. I told him I was the owner of the note, and that I had purchased his debt 12 days ago, speaking to the window without turning around. When he argued that it was a performing loan and he had never missed a payment, I corrected him, stating it was a fraudulent loan because he had fabricated his income, triggering a default event regardless of payment history, and that we were not there to discuss his payment history, but his character. He stood up demanding to see the manager, and I slowly swiveled the heavy leather chair around the mechanism, silent until I faced him and saw his face flushed with indignation, his mouth open to deliver another threat before the words died in his throat as his eyes went wide, not with recognition at first, but with confusion, trying to reconcile the image of the destitute, pleading father he had rejected on the phone with the man sitting before him in a $3,000 suit, radiating power. He whispered Dad as if it were a hallucination, and I told him to sit down using the same voice I used when he was 12 and had been caught stealing from the corner store. He collapsed into the chair, his legs giving out, stammering that he didn't understand because I had said I lost the house and was homeless. I told him I lied, just like he lied on his loan application, and just like he lied when he said he was remodeling, and just like he lied when he said he couldn't help me. Arthur slid a folder across the table, explaining it contained the deed to his house and the confession of judgment regarding the mortgage fraud, presenting him with two choices, where option A was turning the file over to the FBI for mortgage fraud, which is a felony punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million, meaning he would go to jail. Sarah would lose the house anyway, and his child would be born while he was incarcerated. Julian was shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable tremor, looking from Arthur to me with wet eyes, asking what this was. So I presented option B, which was signing the deed over to Atlas Capital, meaning to me effective immediately vacating the Atlas Company's property by January, first acknowledging the debt, and in exchange, I would not file the criminal charges, allowing him to walk away with a clean record, but with nothing else. He croaked that I was evicting him, reminding me he was my son and Sarah was pregnant, and it was Christmas, so I told him I knew because I had asked him for help at Christmas, and he had sent me $50. I picked up my phone and opened the Venmo app, turning the screen toward him, so the transaction was glowing in the high-definition light, showing the $50 and the Santa emoji, which was the valuation he assigned to the man who raised him. He shouted that he didn't know I had money, and if he knew I was okay, he wouldn't have done it, claiming he was just stressed. But I leaned forward, telling him that was the point, because the test wasn't about money, it was about decency, and if he had offered me the guest room or a meal, or just shown up, I would have given him everything. I pulled the bank statement from the folder, the one showing the $35 million, and slid it across the mahogany, where Julian looked at the number, his eyes bulging as he stopped breathing, staring at the digits. $35,412,980.14, and I watched his soul break as he realized in that split second the magnitude of his error, because he hadn't just lost a house, he had lost an empire. He looked up at me, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, asking if I really had $35 million, and I confirmed that I did, and that he would never see a penny of it. He started to cry, then not the manipulative tears of a child caught in a lie, but the weeping of a man watching his future incinerate, begging and pleading and invoking his mother's name, claiming she wouldn't want this, but I cut through, his sobbing like a razor, telling him that his mother died, wondering why he couldn't be bothered to visit her in hospice, and that he was not to speak her name in this room. I stood up, making the movement final, and told him to sign the papers or I would call the FBI, giving him 5 minutes before walking to the window to look out at the city, refusing to look at him, as he whispered frantically to himself, and I heard the scratching of a pen, the sound of a man signing away his life. When he was done, Arthur collected the documents, and Julian sat there, slumped and defeated, a shell of the man who had walked in, so I told him to get out without turning around, and he left, walking out of the office, out of the building, into the cold Chicago wind, where I watched from the window as a small figure emerged onto the sidewalk 42 stories below and hailed a cab looking very small from up there. The aftermath was swift and clinical as Julian and Sarah moved out on December 30th, and I didn't oversee the eviction, hiring a property management company to handle the keys while they moved into a rented townhouse in a far western suburb, a significant downgrade from their Lincoln Park palace. The social fallout was harder to track, but inevitable, as the remodel story fell apart and friends asked questions about the the sudden move and the loss of the Tesla, which was repossessed when he couldn't keep up the payments without the proper home equity line he had been relying on, all pointing to failure. I heard through the grapevine that Sarah had filed for separation 3 months later, shortly after the baby was born, apparently unable to withstand the stress of the financial collapse and the revelation of Julian's fraud, which I suspect he had to confess to her to explain why they were homeless. Julian was living alone, working as a freelance consultant, trying to rebuild from zero, sending me long rambling emails, apologizing and explaining and begging for another chance, along with photos of the grandson I had never met, but I didn't block him and I didn't reply, simply archiving them in a folder named The Past. The resolution came slowly over the course of the next few years, and I didn't buy a villa in Tuscany, finding I had no desire to run away, but instead stayed in Chicago, buying a comfortable, unassuming condo in the Gold Coast and establishing the Martha Reynolds Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to providing financial assistance to elderly people facing housing insecurity. I poured my energy into it, spending my days reviewing grant applications and funding legal aid clinics, ensuring that no one else would have to feel the terror I had simulated, which was fulfilling work that gave my grief a shape and a purpose. I saw Julian one last time, 5 years after the meeting, coming out of the Symphony Center on a rainy Tuesday evening, where I saw him standing under the awning of a nearby building, waiting for a ride share, looking older and having lost weight, wearing a raincoat that looked like it came from a department store rack and holding a folding umbrella. He looked tired and worn down by the friction of a life without a safety net, and when he saw me, our eyes locked across the wet pavement. He didn't wave or try to approach, but just looked at me with a profound, sad resignation and nodded, a small, humble gesture of acknowledgement. I nodded back, and then I got into my car, and the driver pulled away, and I didn't feel triumph in that moment, nor anger, but a quiet, philosophical peace, because I had taught him the lesson that had cost us both our relationship, but had saved him from becoming a monster. He was struggling, yes, but he was real, living a life he had actually earned, not one he had stolen, and I was living mine with the $35 million, safe and working to help strangers who would never thank me, but who would never leave me to die alone. The ledger was balanced, and the test was concluded as I watched the rain streak, the window of the car blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and red, and for the first time in years I thought of Martha and smiled, knowing she would have said I was too hard on him, but also knowing she would have understood that sometimes the only way to save a soul is to break the ego that imprisons it. I had broken him to fix him, and that I decided as the car merged onto Lakeshore Drive was the most responsible thing a father could do.